So, let's talk about what happens when a nation tries to play chess against a grandmaster but only knows how to play checkers. We saw it happen in real time. Canada, feeling the immense pressure of President Trump's America First doctrine, thought it could outmaneuver the master. They packed their bags and went on a little European tour, believing that cozying up to Sweden and Finland would somehow give them an edge against Washington. It was a bold plan, I'll give them that, but it was also a profoundly foolish one. What unfolded wasn't a display of strategic genius. It was a spectacle of desperation that blew up in their faces with catastrophic results. They paraded through Stockholm and Helsinki, staging photo ops and shaking hands, broadcasting to the world that they had other options. But who were they trying to convince? The world or themselves? Because back in Washington, nobody was fooled. Nobody was scared. In fact, this desperate dash for new allies did the exact opposite of what they intended. It didn't project strength. It put Canada's glaring weakness on display for the entire world to see. They gave up all their leverage, dropped their own retaliatory tariffs, and came away with absolutely nothing. Trump didn't even have to make a move. He just watched them fold. The Financial Times even confirmed it for anyone who was still in doubt. Canada's grand Nordic adventure yielded zero relief from American tariffs. Nothing. A complete and utter failure. Their big idea was painfully simple. If America wouldn't play fair, maybe these distant Nordic countries would. They started whispering about potential military contracts, hinting at deals for critical minerals, and even dangled the ultimate carrot, the possibility of buying Swedish fighter jets instead of American ones. But was President Trump shaking in his boots? Was he losing sleep over this? Of course not. This wasn't a power play. It was the geopolitical equivalent of a teenager threatening to run away from home. The parents know they'll be back as soon as they get hungry. This pathetic attempt to find leverage was just empty talk, and everyone knew it. People online saw right through the charade, pointing out that no amount of icebreaker deals or defense pacts with Finland could ever replace the colossal economic reality of their neighbor to the south. America is the market. It is the destination for the vast majority of Canadian goods. No shiny new alliance in Europe changes that fundamental, unshakable truth. The handshakes, the speeches, the entire diplomatic tour, it was all just hollow theater. They were searching for a weapon to bring to the negotiating table, but they showed up completely unarmed. President Trump had already set the rules of the game. He controls the entire board, and when anyone steps out of line, he brings down the hammer of tariffs, and they scurry right back into place. That is the reality. The American economy is the sun, and Canada is a planet caught in its orbit. No fighter jet from Sweden is going to alter the laws of economic gravity. And let's talk about those fighter jets for a moment. For years, it was practically a foregone conclusion that Canada would purchase the American-made Lockheed Martin F-35. This was the pinnacle of fifth-generation stealth technology, a symbol of the deep military integration between our two nations. The contracts were all but signed. But then the political winds shifted. The America First era arrived, and suddenly Ottawa got nervous. They started talking about strategic autonomy, this sudden realization that depending on a single powerful ally might not be the safest bet. It was a wake-up call, they said. So, the F-35 deal was put on ice. The government, under the leadership of Prime Minister Mark Carney, announced a full reassessment. And that's when they started floating this other idea, a contender that had previously been dismissed, the Swedish Saab Gripen. Now, on paper, the Gripen is a fourth-generation fighter. It doesn't have the advanced stealth capabilities of the F-35, but Sweden made a tempting offer. They promised to assemble the planes in Canada, creating local jobs. They highlighted that the Gripen was designed for rugged, Arctic conditions and could operate from makeshift runways. And, most importantly, it didn't require the deep systematic integration with the American military that the F-35 did. This wasn't just about buying a plane. It was a declaration of independence. It was a symbol, but it was a symbol of defiance from a nation with no power to back it up. When President Trump hit them with tariffs, he wasn't just making a suggestion. He was showing them precisely who was in charge. And when he makes a promise, he keeps it. The government in Ottawa can talk all day about standing up to America, but the moment those tariffs became real, they crumbled. They didn't just bend the knee. They fell to their faces and asked, how high should we jump? They immediately withdrew their own retaliatory taxes. They put their digital levies on the shelf. They began dismantling their own trade defenses without a fight. Why? Because the message from Trump was brutally clear. If you play games with us, your economy will pay the price. You need us infinitely more than we need you. Canada was the first to blink in this high-stakes standoff, and that's precisely why this whole Nordic strategy was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. Sweden and Finland might have enjoyed their moment in the international spotlight, but everyone knew who held the real power. President Trump has proven over and over again that when America decides to flex its economic muscle, smaller nations have no choice but to comply. It's just the way the world works. The Canadian government is learning that lesson the hard way. All their tough talk means nothing when they have to come crawling back to beg for access to the very market they tried to defy. How's that working out for you, Carney? The blowback has been absolutely brutal. Ottawa thought it could project an image of strength by linking arms with its new European friends, but all it did was reveal its own powerlessness. They surrendered on tariffs and got absolutely nothing in return. Not a single concession, not one symbolic gesture from Washington. President Trump didn't have to do a thing. He just let them squirm, and eventually they cracked under the pressure all on their own. And back home, the political fallout has been devastating. The critics are having a field day. The Prime Minister promised the Canadian people he'd go elbows up, that he'd show some of that famous hockey toughness. Instead, he delivered a masterclass in retreat. The voters see it clearly. They see a nation that's being completely outplayed and economically dominated by America. And President Trump? He's just smiling because every single concession Canada makes proves the point he's been making all along. America sets the terms, period. Canada and Sweden can sign all the partnership agreements they want, but without the seal of approval from Washington, those documents aren't worth the paper they're printed on. This whole affair has been about optics, not outcomes. It's a public relations campaign designed to mask a total strategic failure. President Trump is simply reminding the world that America remains the undisputed political and economic center of gravity. Any ally that tries to box him in ends up getting thoroughly beaten down. Canada thought teaming up with Sweden would be a warning shot across America's bow. Instead, it was a white flag of surrender. The gambit backfired instantaneously, and it only made President Trump's position stronger. This is why his opponents consistently lose. While they are busy scrambling for some imaginary leverage, he remains steadfast, knowing they will always be the first to fold. They thought that by unilaterally dropping their defenses, they could soften his stance. What an incredible miscalculation. Instead of gaining leverage, they gave away their bargaining power before they even entered the room. Trump didn't meet them halfway, he just waited. That is the art of the deal. You never, ever give up something for nothing. Ottawa blinked, and Trump won, without lifting a finger. The deafening silence from the White House spoke volumes more than any press release ever could. For Canada, it was the absolute worst-case scenario. They gave up ground, they got nothing in return, and now their economy is more exposed and vulnerable than ever. President Trump is a master of timing and pressure. He lets his opponents panic, and then he simply collects the winnings. He has the strongest hand at the table, and he dictates the pace of the game. The leadership in Canada forgot that simple truth. When you give away your power, you don't get rewarded for your kindness, you get ignored. That is the price you pay for a weak strategy against a truly strong leader. Back in Ottawa, the political knives are out. Prime Minister Carney promised to be a fighter, but he dropped his guard at the first sign of trouble. Now, critics are calling him soft, weak, and incapable of defending his country's interests. And Trump sees it. He knows this is an easy win. This isn't just bad optics. This is political suicide. Every concession Carney made is fueling outrage at home. The people are asking, what did we gain from all this? The answer is simple. Nothing but embarrassment. They look like a government that is bending over backwards to appease Washington, and Trump is racking up wins without even having to sign a piece of legislation. Carney's legacy is quickly becoming a cautionary tale. Leaders who try to posture against President Trump without any real leverage always get crushed. The opposition is pouncing, the voters are furious, and the Prime Minister's credibility is in tatters. And through it all, Trump remains calm, unshaken, and stronger than ever. Sure, this Nordic pivot sounds impressive. Icebreakers, fighter jets, new alliances, it all has that new car smell. It sounds exciting. But when you look past the headlines, the math just doesn't add up. Sweden and Finland can offer symbolic support, maybe a few joint military exercises, but none of that can replace the raw, overwhelming power of the United States market. Canada depends on America for its trade, its security, and its investment. That is why this alliance is all style and no substance. Trump knows it, they know it, and the entire world knows it. Ottawa can hold as many parades as they want, but at the end of the day, they know who really owns the game. America remains the center of the economic universe. This desperate maneuver only highlights Canada's weakness. They tried to run a bluff, and President Trump called it without hesitation. They lost, and the whole world was watching. That's the danger of pretending that a few handshakes can counter hard American power. They can't. Trump's grip on this game is absolute. And ultimately, Canada's diplomatic play with Sweden was not a strategy. It was a surrender dressed up as diplomacy. Trump didn't just win the standoff. He exposed just how fragile Ottawa's position truly island. The message to the world could not be clearer. In this game of global power, Donald Trump makes the rules and everyone else is just reacting to them. The presidency of Donald Trump heralded a paradigm shift in American foreign policy. characterized by the disruptive America First doctrine. This approach, prioritizing transactional unilateralism over traditional alliance building, fundamentally altered the global geopolitical landscape. For America's closest and most integrated allies, the period represented an unprecedented challenge. Perhaps no nation felt this shift more acutely than Canada, a country whose economic prosperity and security architecture have been deeply intertwined with the United States for over a century. Faced with punitive trade tariffs and unpredictable diplomacy, Canadian policymakers were forced to navigate a delicate balancing act, preserving the vital economic relationship with their southern neighbor while simultaneously seeking to insulate the nation from its volatility. This essay analyzes Canada's diplomatic and military overtures towards Sweden and Finland during this period as a critical case study in modern middle power strategy. These actions, dubbed the Nordic pivot, were not merely a reactive tantrum, as some narratives suggest, but a calculated, albeit constrained, response to a rapidly changing world. By examining the strategic rationale behind this policy, the intense debate it fueled over military procurement, and the unyielding economic realities that ultimately limited its efficacy, we can gain a deeper understanding of the profound challenges facing nations attempting to assert strategic autonomy in the shadow of a superpower. The Canadian experience serves as a crucial lesson on the limits of diplomacy when confronted with the raw leverage of economic asymmetry. The strategic rationale for a Nordic pivot to characterize Canada's engagement with Sweden and Finland as an act of simple desperation is to overlook a long-standing and deliberate objective of Canadian foreign policy: trade diversification. For decades, successive Canadian governments have recognized the inherent vulnerability of an economy where roughly 75% of all exports are destined for a single market. The Trump administration's willingness to weaponize this economic dependence through the imposition of steel and aluminum tariffs under a national security pretext, Section 232, transformed this latent vulnerability into an immediate crisis. In this context, the outreach to Sweden and Finland was a logical and multifaceted strategy. First, it represented a tangible step in advancing the goals of the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, between Canada and the European Union. As EU members, Sweden and Finland were natural partners for expanding trade and investment links, providing a potential, if modest, counterweight to the American market. Second, the partnership was built on a foundation of shared values and strategic interests. Canada, Sweden, and Finland are all Arctic nations with a deep commitment to multilateralism, environmental stewardship, and the rules-based international order principles that were directly challenged by the America First agenda. With Finland's membership and Sweden's eventual accession to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this alignment on security matters was further solidified, creating a coalition of like-minded states. Finally, the pivot was an exercise in political signaling. The high-profile meetings between the Canadian Prime Minister and his Nordic counterparts, including key business leaders from companies like Saab and Ericsson, were designed to communicate a message to Washington. Canada would not be a passive subject of American policy. By actively cultivating other powerful relationships, Ottawa sought to create at least the perception of leverage, hoping to remind the United States that while it was the most important partner, it was not the only one. This was less about finding an immediate replacement for the American economy and more about asserting its identity as a sovereign nation with its own distinct foreign policy interests. The fighter jet conundrum, a symbol of strategic choice. Nowhere did this tension between alliance integration and strategic autonomy manifest more clearly than in the debate over Canada's next-generation fighter jet. The procurement process, already a politically fraught exercise, was elevated into a potent symbol of Canada's future foreign policy orientation. The choice was framed as one between the American-made Lockheed Martin F-35 and the Swedish Saab Gripen. The case for the F-35 was, and remains, overwhelmingly compelling from a military strategic perspective. As the premier fifth-generation stealth fighter, its capabilities are unmatched. More importantly, its selection would ensure maximum interoperability with Canada's most crucial defense partners through NORAD and NATO, particularly the United States Air Force. Opting for a different platform risked creating a capability gap that could sideline the Royal Canadian Air Force in future coalition operations. For decades, the cornerstone of Canadian defense policy has been seamless integration with the U.S. military, and the F-35 represented the continuation of that doctrine. However, the arguments for the Gripen resonated powerfully with the political imperatives of the moment. Saab presented a compelling package centered on industrial and technological benefits, ITBs, promising to conduct final assembly in Canada, which would create thousands of high-skilled jobs. Operationally, the Gripen was marketed as a rugged, reliable aircraft designed for the harsh, cold weather conditions of Northern Europe, making it an excellent fit for patrolling Canada's vast Arctic territory. Furthermore, its acquisition and operational costs were projected to be significantly lower than those of the F-35. But his most salient advantage was political. Choosing a non-American platform would be the ultimate expression of strategic autonomy. It would diversify Canada's military supply chain and signal that its defense policy would not be dictated by Washington's preferences. This debate forced a critical national conversation about the true price of the American security umbrella and whether the benefits of interoperability outweighed the risks of overdependence. The unyielding reality of economic asymmetry. Despite the sound strategic logic behind the Nordic pivot and the compelling arguments for diversifying military hardware, Canadian policy ultimately collided with the unyielding reality of its economic relationship with the United States. The core point of the video's triumphant narrative, while biased, is analytically sound. The sheer scale of the economic asymmetry between the two nations grants Washington immense structural power. When over 3/4 of a country's exports and hundreds of billions of dollars in bilateral trade are at stake, diplomatic signaling can quickly be rendered moot by coercive economic statecraft. The Trump administration's use of tariffs was a masterclass in exploiting this leverage. By threatening Canada's access to the American market, Washington was able to force Ottawa to renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement on terms more favorable to the U.S., resulting in the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. In the face of this pressure, Canada made significant concessions. It blinked first. This outcome demonstrated that while strengthening ties with the EU and other partners is a prudent long-term goal, it provides little defense against immediate economic warfare from a determined superpower neighbor. The value of new trade deals with Sweden, measured in the millions or low billions, could not offset the potential loss of tens of billions in trade with the US. This dynamic exposed the limitations of Canada's position. Its tough talk was ultimately superseded by pragmatic capitulation on key trade issues. The Nordic pivot, therefore, could be viewed not as a failure but as an experiment that confirmed a difficult hypothesis. For a middle power as economically integrated with the US as Canada, true strategic autonomy is an aspiration, not a current reality. The nation's foreign policy is inevitably constrained by the necessity of maintaining a stable and predictable economic relationship with its continental partner. Conclusion. Lessons from a geopolitical stress test. The clash between Canada and the Trump administration was more than a temporary diplomatic spat. It was a profound geopolitical stress test that laid bare the structural realities of the North American relationship. Canada's Nordic pivot was a rational and well-conceived strategy to mitigate the risk posed by an unpredictable American administration. It was an attempt to reclaim agency, build coalitions with like-minded partners, and remind the world and itself that it was more than just America's 51st state. Ultimately, however, the initiative was circumscribed by the immense gravitational pull of the American economy. The episode did not end in a simple victory for one side and defeat for the other. Instead, it provided a sobering lesson in the limits of middle power diplomacy. While Canada was forced to concede on trade, its diplomatic outreach succeeded in strengthening valuable relationships in Europe and sparked a vital domestic debate on the future of its foreign policy. The fact that the Canadian government ultimately committed to purchasing a fleet of 88 F-35 fighter jets in 2022 signaled a pragmatic return to the security of alliance integration. Yet, the memory of this period endures. It damaged a generation of trust and forced Canada to view its closest ally through a new lens, one that accounts for the possibility of hostility. The experience has likely embedded a permanent sense of caution in Ottawa, reinforcing the long-term necessity of diversification, even if its short-term effects are limited. For Canada, and for other middle powers around the globe, the lesson was clear. Navigating the world requires building a wide network of friends, but it also requires a clear-eyed understanding of who holds the ultimate leverage.